I never thought a missing key would become the reason I crossed a line I could never fully uncross. This happened almost 12 years ago, when I was 31 and drowning in debt. I wasn't the kind of person who robbed banks or carried weapons. At least, that's what I told myself back then. I preferred to think of myself as someone who made bad decisions under pressure. Looking back now, I realized that distinction mattered only to me. At the time, I worked maintenance for a small apartment complex on the edge of town. The pay was terrible, my gambling habit was getting worse, and collection agencies had begun calling me several times a day. Every ring of the phone felt like a reminder that I was failing at life. The apartment complex had an elderly owner named Mr. Garrison. He trusted me more than he should have. He often left me alone with paperwork, tenant records, and access to nearly every room in the building. Trust is a strange thing. Most people think it makes relationships stronger. Sometimes it simply creates opportunities. One afternoon, while repairing a broken lock in the basement storage area, I overheard Mr. Garrison talking to a tenant. He mentioned an old safe hidden in his office. The safe supposedly contained cash reserves he kept for emergencies instead of depositing everything at the bank. I remember pretending not to listen. I also remember listening very carefully. For weeks afterward, the thoughts sat in the back of my mind. Every overdue bill, every threatening letter, every sleepless night pushed that thought a little closer to the front. Then something happened that made the idea seem less like a fantasy and more like a possibility. Mr. Garrison lost a key. It wasn't unusual. He was forgetful. The entire building seemed to know about it because he spent days searching for the thing. He checked drawers, closets, maintenance rooms, even trash bins. One morning, while watching him retrace the same hallway for the third time, he laughed and said something I still remember word for word. "A lost key is an item that has been searched for too long." Everyone chuckled. I did too. But unlike everyone else, I knew exactly which key he was talking about. And when I realized what it opened, a plan began forming in my head. A plan that would eventually become the biggest crime of my life. I wish I could say I fought the temptation longer than I did. After Mr. Garrison lost the key, I became obsessed with the safe. Not because I knew how much money was inside, but because I didn't know. My imagination filled in the blanks. Every debt notice on my kitchen table made the safe seem larger and more valuable. I started paying attention to details I'd ignored before. What time Mr. Garrison arrived. When he left. Which tenants stopped by his office. Whether anyone else had access to the room. The maintenance job gave me a perfect excuse to move around the building unnoticed. I repaired locks that didn't need repairing and checked electrical panels that were working fine. Really, I was studying routines. A week later, I learned something important. The lost key wasn't the only way into the safe. There was a combination lock too. That discovery should have stopped me. Instead, it convinced me the theft might actually be possible. And once I started thinking in terms of possible, I stopped thinking about whether I should. The next few weeks turned me into someone I barely recognized. I wasn't stealing anything yet. I wasn't even inside the office after hours. But my thoughts revolved around the safe from the moment I woke up until I fell asleep. Looking back, I think the crime really began there, not with an action, but with a decision I refused to admit I'd already made. I started observing Mr. Garrison more closely. He had habits, like everyone does. Every morning he made coffee before opening the office blinds. Every Friday he reviewed rent payments. And whenever he used the safe, he assumed nobody was paying attention. I was paying attention. Once, while replacing a light fixture in the hallway outside his office, I caught a brief glimpse of his hand moving across the combination dial. I couldn't see the numbers, but I noticed something useful. He always turned the dial slowly and repeated the same pattern. That tiny observation felt like progress. The frightening part wasn't what I was planning. It was how normal the planning had started to feel. The more I watched, the more confident I became, and confidence is dangerous when it's attached to a bad idea. By then, I had convinced myself I wasn't planning a real theft. I told myself I was only gathering information. That lie made it easier to keep going. One evening, after most tenants had gone home, I found an excuse to work near the office. I was replacing weather stripping on a nearby door, or at least pretending to. Through the partly open doorway, I noticed Mr. Garrison writing numbers on a notepad before opening the safe. He tore the page off afterward and dropped it into a wastebasket. That detail stayed with me. Over the next several days, I began mapping out every step in my head. When the office was empty, which entrances had the least traffic, how long I could be inside without attracting attention. The plan still had holes, but it was becoming real. For the first time, I stopped imagining whether I could do it. I started imagining what I would do with the money afterward. The first illegal thing I did was so small that most people wouldn't even notice it. One Friday evening, after Mr. Garrison left for the day, I entered the office under the pretense of checking a faulty window latch. In reality, I went straight to the wastebasket. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could hear it. I dug through crumpled receipts, envelopes, and scraps of paper until I found what I was looking for, several torn sheets covered with handwritten numbers. Most were meaningless. A few looked promising. I slipped them into my pocket. The entire visit lasted less than 2 minutes, but walking back to my apartment felt like carrying stolen gold. Every tenant I passed seemed suspicious. Every glance felt accusatory. At home, I spread the papers across my kitchen table and studied them for hours. Some were phone numbers. Others were payment records. But one sequence appeared repeatedly. I couldn't prove it was connected to the safe. Still, deep down, I knew I had just crossed a line. And crossing it had been far easier than I expected. A few days after taking the papers, I stopped pretending I was only curious. I had narrowed the possibilities down to what I believed was the safe's combination. There was no guarantee I was right, but the numbers appeared often enough to keep me convinced. The next step was the one that mattered. I chose a Tuesday night. The building was usually quiet then. Most tenants stayed home, and Mr. Garrison never worked late on Tuesdays. I spent the entire day acting normal, fixing a leaking faucet and replacing hallway bulbs while secretly counting the hours. As evening approached, my nerves became unbearable. I nearly backed out several times. Then I would think about my debts, the collection notices, the feeling that my life was shrinking. Around 9 o'clock I made my move. I already had access to the building, so getting inside wasn't difficult. What terrified me was the possibility of being seen near the office after hours. The hallway seemed impossibly loud. Every footstep echoed. Every creak sounded like an alarm. And yet I kept walking toward the office door. The office door wasn't locked. That should have made me feel relieved, but instead it made everything more real. For weeks, the theft had existed mostly in my imagination. Now I was standing inside a dark office with a flashlight in my hand and no excuse for being there. I closed the door behind me and listened. Nothing. Just the hum of an old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. The safe sat exactly where I expected it to be, hidden behind a cabinet door. Seeing it sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I remember staring at it for several seconds before kneeling beside it. My hands were shaking. I entered the first combination from the papers. Nothing. The second. Nothing again. A cold wave of panic hit me. Maybe I had been wrong from the beginning. Then I tried the third sequence. The lock clicked. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. The safe doors slowly opened, revealing stacks of cash, documents, and several sealed envelopes. The hardest part of the crime wasn't getting inside. It was deciding what to do now that I had succeeded. The sight of the money overwhelmed me. For weeks, the safe had been an idea, a symbol of escape. Now it was real. Bundles of cash were stacked neatly inside, far more than I had expected. My first instinct was to grab everything and run. Fortunately, fear kept me from doing something that stupid. I remembered every crime show I'd ever watched. If the safe was emptied, the theft would be discovered immediately. If only part of the money disappeared, maybe it would take longer for anyone to notice. At least that was my reasoning at the time. I took several bundles and stuffed them into a canvas tool bag I had brought with me. Even then, I hesitated. Every second felt dangerous. Then I heard a sound. A door closing somewhere in the building. I nearly dropped the bag. The noise was probably innocent, but panic took over. I shut the safe, wiped every surface I remembered touching, and hurried out of the office. The money was finally mine. Instead of relief, all I felt was terror. I barely slept that night. The canvas bag sat in my closet, hidden beneath old clothes, but it felt as if it were glowing in the dark. Every time a car passed outside, I imagined police officers stepping out. Every knock from a neighbor made my stomach tighten. The next morning, I went to work as usual. That was the strangest part. The world looked exactly the same. Tenants complained about maintenance issues. Deliveries arrived. People chatted in the hallways. Nobody seemed aware that a crime had taken place just hours earlier. For most of the day, I convinced myself I had gotten away with it. Then, shortly before closing time, I heard raised voices coming from the office. Mr. Garrison had discovered the missing cash. Word spread through the building quickly. Some tenants speculated about an outside burglar. Others blamed former employees. I joined the conversations and acted surprised. I even helped search for signs of a break-in. The lies came easily. Much easier than the guilt that followed them. The investigation started almost immediately. Not a major police operation, just a series of interviews and questions. Still, it was enough to make every day feel like a test I wasn't prepared for. An officer visited the building and spoke with employees one by one. When my turn came, I tried to appear calm. I answered everything directly, careful not to volunteer extra information. The officer asked where I had been on Tuesday night. I had rehearsed that answer dozens of times. Even so, my mouth felt dry as I gave it. What frightened me most wasn't the possibility of being caught in a lie. It was the possibility that someone had actually seen me. A tenant returning home late. A visitor passing through the hallway. Anyone. Days passed, and no accusations came. But another problem emerged. Mr. Garrison looked genuinely hurt. Not angry. Not furious. Hurt. He spoke often about trust and betrayal, unaware that the person helping him repair locks and check doors was the very person who had stolen from him. Just when I thought the situation was stabilizing, something happened that nearly unraveled everything. The lost key was found. One of the tenants discovered it behind a radiator in a storage room that had been cleaned for the first time in months. What had seemed like a meaningless detail suddenly became important again. The moment I heard the news, my stomach dropped. Until then, much of the suspicion had centered on the idea that someone had forced access to the safe or somehow exploited the missing key. Now the key had been accounted for. Investigators began looking more closely at people who already had legitimate access to the building. People like me. Nobody accused me directly, but I noticed subtle changes. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. Questions became more specific. A few tenants asked whether I had been working late recently. I answered casually and laughed things off. Inside, I was terrified. The key's discovery should have been unrelated to my theft. Instead, it brought attention back to the one group of people who could move through the building unnoticed. Fear makes people do foolish things. The smarter choice would have been to leave everything alone and attract as little attention as possible. Instead, I became obsessed with protecting myself. I started moving the stolen money from place to place. One week it was hidden in my apartment. The next, it was inside a rented storage locker across town. Every relocation felt safer for a few hours before the anxiety returned. Meanwhile, I spent money cautiously, afraid that any sudden purchase would look suspicious. Ironically, the cash I had risked so much to obtain became something I was terrified to use. The pressure affected my behavior. I grew irritable and withdrawn. Friends noticed. Coworkers noticed. Even Mr. Garrison noticed. One afternoon, he asked if everything was all right. That simple question hit harder than any police interview. He sounded concerned, not suspicious. For a brief moment, I considered confessing. I imagined returning the money and ending the nightmare. But fear won. I thanked him, lied about personal problems, and walked away carrying a guilt that felt heavier every day. For months, I believed my biggest risk had been the theft itself. I was wrong. The real danger came afterward. One evening, desperate to reduce some of my debt, I used part of the stolen cash to pay off a private loan I owed an acquaintance. It seemed harmless. There were no banks involved, no official records connecting the money to me. What I didn't know was that the man had been complaining publicly about the debt for months. When I suddenly repaid the entire amount, people noticed. The questions began almost immediately. Had I inherited money? Won a bet? Found a better job? I laughed off the rumors, but every explanation sounded weak. A few weeks later, one of my coworkers casually mentioned hearing about my repayment. The comment lasted only seconds, yet it sent panic through me. For the first time, I understood a painful truth. Crimes don't end when they're committed. They continue through every decision afterward. And the more lies required to protect the original lie, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before any of them started. The end came almost a year after the theft. Not with a dramatic arrest or a detective revealing some brilliant piece of evidence. It happened because enough small details accumulated in one place. A tenant remembered seeing lights in the office on the night of the theft. A coworker mentioned that I had been unusually interested in the investigation. Questions about my finances never completely disappeared. Individually, none of those things proved anything. Together, they painted a picture. One afternoon, I was asked to come in for another interview. By then, I was exhausted. A year of anxiety had worn me down more than I realized. Every conversation felt dangerous. Every phone call triggered fear. The officers weren't aggressive. In fact, they were patient. That somehow made things worse. As they laid out the timeline and inconsistencies in my statements, I felt the walls closing in. For months I had been carrying a secret that consumed nearly every thought. Sitting there, listening to the evidence, I finally understood that I was no longer fighting to stay free. I was fighting myself, eventually I confessed. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, though it was getting close. Not because I suddenly became brave. The truth is much less dramatic. I was tired. Tired of remembering which version of events I had told which person. Tired of jumping whenever someone mentioned the theft. Tired of living in a world where every act of kindness from Mr. Garrison felt like an accusation. The stolen money was recovered only in part. Much of it had already been spent on debts and expenses. I was arrested, convicted, and forced to face consequences I had spent a year trying to avoid. The punishment mattered, but what stayed with me most was the realization that I had betrayed someone who trusted me. That old saying still comes back to me sometimes. A lost key is an item that has been searched for too long. Back then, I thought it referred to a piece of metal. Now I think it referred to me. If you're standing at the edge of a decision you know is wrong, don't convince yourself you'll fix it later. The hardest prison isn't the one built by courts. It's the one built by your own conscience.